even when you have OKRs, allow for this experimentation, learning, and adaptation, and give your team the scaffolding for experimentation, learning, and adaptation. Even if you have OKRs, fine, great. Define the puzzle for the team. Just like I was talking about in sales, whatever that puzzle was, define what you might have whatever number for sales, but define what is the puzzle you think as a leader
Mhm.
you're not 100% sure of, and invite your team so that you have information from the trenches in terms of what is the real problem, what are they seeing, right? And you define the puzzle together and then invite them to give you information on how they're solving this puzzle in terms of how well is it working, what have you learned, what will you try next? And that's how you can move forward together.
Welcome to the Great Life Experiment podcast. I'm your host, Monique Schaefer, and together we'll grapple with our messy, beautiful, and ever-changing personal and professional lives and the business world around us. I deeply believe there is no one right way to do this thing called life. Let's experiment together. As a quick reminder, friends, please note that this podcast is an independent production, and the information presented here and views expressed here reflect my personal opinion and do not reflect the views or positions of any organization or company that I'm affiliated with. Enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode. Today's guest, Radhika Dutt, is the author of The Radical Product Thinking, The New Mindset for Innovating Smarter. Her methodology introduced in this first book has been used in over 40 countries. She's an entrepreneur. She's a speaker. She's a product leader. She's participated in 5 acquisitions, 2 of which were companies that she founded. She is currently an advisor on product thinking to the Monetary Authority of Singapore, that's Singapore's central bank and financial regulator. She does consulting and training for organizations ranging from high-tech startups to multinationals on building radical products that create fundamental change. Very much appreciate her wide range of experience in industries, broadcasting, media, entertainment, telecom, advertising, technology, government, consumer apps, robotics, and as you'll hear in the episode, even wine. So that's an interesting one. She graduated from MIT in electrical engineering, and she speaks 9 languages. Radhika is now working on her second book, which is about why goals and targets backfire and what actually works. This is a wide-ranging conversation full of experimentation, challenging current assumptions about how we goal set in the corporate space, when do we have vision debt versus survival debt, and applying some of these corporate thinkings also to our personal lives and our careers. I hope you enjoy. Look forward to all the comments. So Radhika, I love your background. I've heard you speak about that you've never held 2 consecutive jobs in the same industry. And I'd love for you to talk about either whether it's kind of a first principle or a mindset about why those different pivots, what they've kind of taught you along the way, and how that has given you a richer perspective because you've had so many different experiences and in different industries. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that because so many people listening are either have transitioned themselves, are thinking about transitioning, and it's no longer that just linear career path in the same industry. So I would love for people to hear kind of your mindset behind that.
Yeah. And transitions are always hard, right? Because I remember early in my career, there was a recruiter who said to me, at some point, you really should consider focusing. And, I would never give that advice to someone in terms of career that you really should focus on an
Mm.
industry or on a particular role. I think transitions are what make us grow. So just in terms of my own background, the roles I held were just as diverse. So, my role right out of college when I founded a startup, yes, my training was in engineering and I was doing sales and business development right out of
Mhm.
college. Lots to learn there. And then I was doing program management, and then I was running strategy, and then I was doing marketing. So product management was something I arrived at actually only maybe actually in the last 10 years. That's when
Mhm,
I really arrived at product, or that's when my title rather arrived at product management. Um,
mhm,
so my point is, just having this variety of industries that I've worked on and having to learn different markets, having to take on
mhm.
different roles, the skill it really hones is patterns, finding patterns and being able to figure out those patterns really quickly. And, what I've arrived at now is this mindset of puzzle setting and puzzle solving. And I feel like it has been this buildup of 25 years of a career in different roles and different industries that has
Mm,
really led to this mindset of puzzle setting and puzzle solving.
mm. Can you say more about puzzle setting and puzzle solving? Because what I appreciate about your approach is you very much being a systems thinker as well. And it feels like that puzzle solving muscle is something that is a skill that's going to be called forth in everybody, and maybe even more in a way that it hasn't in the past because of AI, and we're all solving for problems that we haven't solved before.
Oh my gosh, that's such an important point. And I so identify with that, especially in the era of AI.
Mhm,
I think this puzzle setting and puzzle solving is really what differentiates us from AI. It's
mhm.
our ability to experiment, learn, and adapt. Whereas, AI is really great at optimization. So let's get into that in a moment and sort of
Yeah.
AI. But there are so many other things you said that that I really want to unpack.
Yeah.
I want to go back when you said earlier about first principles, right?
Mhm,
Um, what I find is there are so many resources, whether it's for product management or business or leadership, etc. There are lots of recipes and formulas that are handed out. One very typical example is the Spotify model that, oh, if you just do this, everything works out. Oh, if you just use OKRs in this way, you get these great results. There are all these formulas and recipes that are handed out, right?
yeah.
And what I've found in my experience is this is more like physicists saying, this solution works fantastically, and in fine print, it's, well, if you have spherical cows in vacuum. And so you look at that in your own situation, you go, well, I just tried that. It doesn't work at all for me, right? Um,
Yeah.
and so this is where instead of just applying formulas, if we really um, as we develop a muscle for puzzle setting and puzzle solving,
Mhm,
we really learn to do things at first principles. This
mhm,
doesn't mean discovering things from scratch and reinventing the wheel, but
mhm.
really figuring out sort of how to figure out patterns more efficiently. And that's a lot of what I talk about in puzzle setting and puzzle solving. It's this next book that I'm working on, and the book is about why goals and targets don't work and what actually works. And what I realized in my career is when you set goals and targets, when you have these prescriptive approaches like OKRs, that it doesn't lead to good results. And we can talk about why.
Yeah.
But what actually works instead is a mindset of puzzle setting and puzzle solving. And that really helps you unpack or find patterns and then figure out how to address those patterns in whatever problem that you're working to solve.
What you just said, I know some people listening, is a controversial position. In some ways, it's controversial, and in some ways, it's not, because I think many people would agree. Maybe we can unpack like what are the first principles or ideas of what we're trying to accomplish. So maybe we can go there. But particularly about OKRs, those there is very much a love hate relationship around OKRs. And then, like you were talking about, there's a nuance because I have experienced OKRs that are a helpful focusing and forcing function to get people aligned if people are scattered and doing their own thing to at least it's not about even the OKR, it's the what are we solving for? And do we at least have common ground about what we should be focused on? And then there are OKRs where it's just they're actually more just outputs. Those are the things that you're doing. But then you can also see a hyper focus on, revenue as well. And uh, are the helpful first, we're going to say first principles a lot in this episode, but ideas or mindsets of what about the concept of OKR was helpful and where did it go sideways? Where did the principle break down?
Yeah. What you started with, right, where you were saying OKRs help create the sort of alignment on what should we be doing.
Mhm.
And even that, right, that's a formula that's been given to us that OKRs help create this alignment. Let's just ask a few whys. Why do we need OKRs? Why do we need goals to tell us what we need to do, right? Why do we need OKRs to define the impact that we want to have or define the narrative of the impact? And one of the things that when I was doing this research on why goals and OKRs, what I realized was, this is a mentality that we haven't questioned since the 1940s. That's
Um,
shocking, isn't it? Because we think of OKRs as a very new thing. We think OKRs came in just in 2018 because that's when John Doerr evangelized them. But it turns out even John Doerr says, that OKRs uh, were invented by Andy Grove from Intel in the late 1970s. So then, I looked at Andy Grove and where did he get OKRs from?
Mhm.
So he just modified management by objectives, which Peter Drucker came up with in the 1940s. 1940s, think about how different that workforce was, right? And
Mhm.
so, why did he come up with OKRs? The problem he was solving at the time was General Motors, and the workforce that they had was primarily working on assembly lines with minimal automation. There was really little automation and most tasks were repetitive. And so in that scenario, Peter Drucker had this revolutionary idea that, oh, let's set goals together with employees and then we measure them by it. And you know what? In that workforce, that was easy because you could tell Andy is a better performer than Bob. He installed 45 tires, Bob did 40. And it's really easy because there's one right way to install tires. Now let's look at the complex workforce and we realize, wait a minute, this formula no longer works in our complex workforce. Everything that could be automated mostly has been. The kind of problems that we're solving are really complex. And so let's look at an example of, academia. When you measure researcher by how many papers they've published, to decide whether they get tenure or not, this is where you get toxic work environments in academia, where you also get crappy papers, falsified data sets, and people plagiarizing or taking over each other's work and not giving credit, right? What we need is less of this OKR approach. Why? The other thing that happens with OKRs is when you set an OKR, the incentive it creates in an employee is to show you that it's working. They want to show you that whatever initiative it is, that OKR has been hit. It's green, we're good. And so even subconsciously, you are looking for those good numbers, those good metrics to show you, ta-da. And what we're doing is we're really sweeping under the rug those bad numbers. Whereas what you want is you want people to look at the good and the bad, to play detective, to solve the puzzle by asking, what did I just see here? What
Uh-huh.
just went wrong? That muscle atrophies because of OKRs. So that's a long answer, but there are so many problems with OKRs
Yeah.
that drive us to not solve puzzles. That puzzle solving muscle atrophies with OKRs.
God, I love this conversation. Okay, question for you and kind of poking at that idea. So I've seen in some companies and, read different thought leaders of maybe OKRs, right? The objectives and the key results, that it's helpful at a higher level organization level. So for instance, we are having company wide across sales, across marketing, across product, right? Across highly matrixed organizations of like, we are trying to open this market. We're trying to increase customer satisfaction. We're trying to do this. And so seeing people use OKRs that
go down at maybe the department level, but they don't tie to the example of being like actual performance metrics for individual contributors, right? You need to line up to making sure you're moving something forward, but it doesn't cascade all the way down to individual contributors. So it's more of like a hybrid kind of North Star. What's your reaction to that approach? Because I think it still doesn't get to the problem you're seeing with sweeping at a department level. You just might be sweeping the patterns and like the metrics you don't want to see under the rug. Is that fair? Give me your reaction to that kind of hybrid style where it's not the old school all the way going down to the individual team member.
Yeah. So first of all, don't the whole idea of going all the way to the team member. I agree with you. It really does not work. Like it creates
Oh.
much worse results. So for our listeners, that's the first thing. Definitely don't do that. But secondly, my reaction even to the hybrid, at a department level, the issues are very similar because even at a group level, it's the same thing. You want to show that an initiative is working at a group level. So let's talk about exactly what you said. You also brought up, strategic planning, revenues, etc. So let's talk through a company-wide example and what could you do instead? I'm
Yeah.
going to use the example of, sales, right? So we all have learned that the formula for growing a business is by setting targets for sales. Now let's break that down. What could we do differently? So instead of setting revenue goals is, X million by the end of this year,
Mhm.
what we could do is set a puzzle, right? And here's what this cross functional puzzle would sound like. I would describe it as, the market expects us to hit X million by the end of this year, but I see a problem and a puzzle ahead of us that we need to solve. And here's the problem. What I've seen is growth was going really well. We were on a great trajectory for the last 3 years, but it's kind of plateaued over the last year. What might be happening and how do we get back to that growth trajectory? And here are some, now that I've described this problem statement, here are some guiding questions that I genuinely don't know the answers to, right?
Mm.
So, depending on the scale of your business and the size or the maturity level, here is one example of set of guiding questions. Yours might be different, but just take this as scaffolding. So, here are some guiding questions. One might be, maybe a competitor is now doing something very different. They've leapfrogged us. We've really fallen behind.
Mhm.
Another question might be maybe it's that we knew how to sell to early adopters. That's why our growth trajectory was great. Now, maybe we don't know how to sell to the mass market. How might we learn to sell to that mass market? There might be a product question. Maybe we knew how to meet those needs of those early adopters, but we
Mhm.
aren't quite hitting the spot for the
Yeah.
mass market. So these are just a few guiding questions. The objective is the summary of all of this, which is how do we solve this puzzle to get back to this growth trajectory so that we can grow our business, right? So now I've set the puzzle and this is cross functional. And now every department can take this and start on the puzzle solving. So let's talk about what that puzzle
Mhm.
solving would look like, right? And I'm going to take the sales example.
Yeah.
Um, so the puzzle solving part means answering three questions. So the first question is, how well did it work? And notice, right, instantly, it's not a question of have you or haven't you hit a target. I
Mm.
want the good and the bad. And that's why I'm asking, how well is it working? It's not a binary question. So the first question, how well is it working? The second question is, what have we learned? And this is where I say to teams, don't just, regurgitate data and numbers for me. Tell me the story about what have you figured out? And then the final question, based on how well it's working and what have you learned, what are you going to do next? Right? So let's take the sales example. Maybe, if you were solving this problem about early market to the mass market, maybe
Mhm.
one question you have in sales is, maybe our messaging isn't resonating for the mass market. So we're going to try this new messaging. So how well did it work? Maybe the answer to that was this messaging is actually working much better. We're getting meetings with decision makers. We're getting the right meetings.
Mhm.
Great, that is working. So, what are we learning? That's the next question. How well
Mhm.
are those meetings going? What's happening? Aha, we're having those meetings. Those meetings go well, but we're now learning that there is a different, it's not just this one decision maker. There's a second group within this mass market, which is why we're not growing in the mass market. The
Mhm.
second group needs to be brought on board as well. We have never traditionally spoken to the second group. That's our learning. Now, based on how well it's working and what we've learned, this is where we plan our next action. What will we try next? Right?
Mhm.
This is where I might try, maybe we can work on webinars to reach this other group that we've never talked to before. Maybe
Mhm.
we can create really easy to forward stuff that this one decision maker group can forward to this other group that needs to be brought on board. Let's try, are we reaching a bigger group as a result? Now you can try these next things, and then you repeat the cycle of how well has it worked? What have we learned? What are we going to try next? When you have this puzzle solving mentality, it works so much better than OKRs. What happens with OKRs is I'm trying to prove to you that this is working, as opposed to genuinely questioning and genuinely being curious about
Mhm.
what is working, genuinely, what am I learning and what will I try next? As a leader, it gives you so much more visibility that you're actually learning from the trenches, the truth from the ground, as opposed to what people want to tell you, not maliciously, but just
Mhm.
subconsciously.
What's really interesting about that, and obviously one of the reasons I thought this would be great, given that the podcast is called the Great Life Experiment, but that coming from a place of curiosity, coming together, experimenting, and actually having shorter iteration and feedback loops to know how to move forward rather than spending 5 weeks trying to create the perfect representation with 6 months in. Some fundamental assumption has changed anyway, and you probably need to refresh those well-crafted 4-week long, right? OKRs anyway. So I love the iterative process. If I'm part of a leadership team, right? I'm in the C-suite, I'm part of the executive team for a company that I no longer know every single person's name. Like I'm at some sort of scale, maybe we're not co-located anymore. And I hear what you're saying, and like, yes, I want a culture of learning and iteration, but I see what you just talked about, or I hear what you just talked about is how my team's going to do it. How do I, as the leadership team, know that my company and my organization is on track if I don't have a metric, right? Because I think there's still going to be that bias. So assuming I'm playing the devil's advocate, I'm not
Yeah.
CEO, I have 5,000 plus person company. Love it. Got it. We don't like OKRs anyway. But how do I know at that level that I'm able to aggregate that I actually do have everybody moving in that right direction? So for them, the metric forward CEO and C-suite, how would you address that concern?
One big misconception about puzzle setting and puzzle solving is, this is all fun and games and we're not measuring or we're not serious and
Mhm.
rigorous about metrics, right? Quite the contrary, actually. So, what I find with teams is when you have OKRs, because we're trying to create focus, we create a short list of, just very, very few metrics that you really want to focus people on. And so people focus on those metrics, but they're ignoring a lot of the other metrics that are actually the leading indicators that tell you so much more in terms of what's going on.
Mhm.
When I do this thing of how well is it working? What have we learned? What are we going to do next with teams? The measurement is actually a lot more rigorous in terms of, well, it's a lot more rigorous than OKRs, right? Because there's a lot more stuff I want them to measure to
Mhm.
figure out what those measurements are telling you and then
Mhm.
tell me the story of what you're learning. I will obviously, it's not just that I'm not listening to the metrics too. In
Mhm.
fact, I then ask them very pointed questions about those metrics. I'll give you
Mhm.
an example. We were looking at a dashboard to see how well a feature is working. Are people using this in the way that we intended? And
Mhm.
is it leading to better sales because of this feature?
Uh-huh.
And if it's not, what are we going to do next, right? So
Yeah.
one person on the team, in terms of what have we learned, he was sharing with me that, well, we have this dashboard, and what it's showing is this user, this type of a user, 40% of the time they're using this feature. And I was
Mhm.
like, okay, tell me more about that metric. Are you getting that 40% number because someone lands on that as their dashboard?
Mhm.
Or is it because they come back to it because that's the default dashboard that you land on, right?
Mhm.
So this is the kind of rigorous measurement. And when the person wasn't sure, right? Now I know, okay, I know exactly how well you've been sort of really digging into the numbers. And I am now pushing you to dive deeper into numbers. Tell me what you've actually learned. What is happening in terms of the user's flow? What are they actually doing on our product, right? And
Yeah.
then I can plan what they're doing next. So, in fact, we're a lot more rigorous about measurement, metrics, and what we're going to do next. This is how you get the real information on the ground. And
Mhm.
as leadership, you actually have a lot more, measurement actually becomes more actionable. You have a lot more control, both over seeing early on how the metrics are evolving, right? But also what level of risk you want people to take. So that answer in terms of what will you do next? When someone tells me they want to do something that's going to take 6 months to develop, I'll say, whoa, whoa, I am not willing to put that much of an investment into this. I want you to figure out how can you take a smaller risk in terms of what we try next. And so they might try something smaller. Maybe it's trying out a prototype,
Yes.
etc., or something even smaller, a baby step first. And I want to see the results of that before we can do something bigger, right? So this is the kind of active handholding and shaping that you get a chance to do as a leader. And depending on who has how much skill, it's a different level of handholding.
Yes. And this framework that you've had, right? So if one representation of what we think hasn't been working in the modern era is OKR, you're coining this objective hypothesis learning, OHL. Um, um,
Exactly.
and what really resonates about what you're saying, especially using the word hypothesis, right? Because it is that question. And so how are you going to answer that question? And so I think in that word, hopefully people are really clear that you, just like if you're doing any kind of scientific study, like you are going to set up some sort of experiment, you're going to measure, you are going to learn, you're going to adjust. And what I appreciate what you just said about risk is something that I talk a lot about with my teams in the product cycle of being in the discovery phase of what is the problem we are trying to solve, outcome we're trying to achieve, the want, need, desire, and then the designing of how would we think about solving for that and the multiple steps or multiple solution options rather than just jumping to this is how we have to solve for it. And people tend to do a good job of coming up with multiple solutions. Then there's you immediately cut the teams in half that are really good at experimentation. And then you cut the teams even smaller that are good at designing experiments that also test their assumptions and their highest risk and de-risking. And so it feels like those are discrete kind of skill sets that people and teams and organizations need to grow in terms of how well are you defining the problem space versus coming together to iterate on it. Then how do you even craft a good experiment? And oh, by the way, are you even aware of your assumptions and which one is the highest risk? Like
Yeah.
I think that risk analysis also, and then feeding back the learnings before you make a decision is something that many organizations are learning how to build that muscle because it does take time. There is a bias towards, I'm just going to go do and then I'll learn from there. But that is a really expensive learning process. And often you get kind of lagging indicators. So speaking of indicators, and you've talked a lot about metrics, you've spoken and written about the concept of vanity metrics. Can you talk more about what that means?
There is so much to unpack in what you said. Like,
Oh,
I
yeah,
do
but
want to
don't talk what I just said, and then we can talk about vanity metrics.
I love so many things. Okay, let's rewind just a couple of steps. Like, what you said about being able to make metrics more actionable, learning along the way. You know, there's this amazing quote that I came across actually in my research recently. The quote is, "You don't learn from experience, you learn from reflecting on experience." Right?
Mm,
This whole idea that, I'll just try things and then I'll learn. The problem is we never go back and reflect. We don't take that time to reflect, so we don't truly learn from that experience, right?
mhm,
There's another thing that you said earlier, which is in a large organization, you set OKRs, and as a leader, you know, when even setting all those OKRs across functions takes a really long time. And then what you just talked about, you try these things. There are different aspects of this, hypotheses, etc., that you're trying out. Teams are trying experiments. You learn when you set OKRs, that entire process of learning from those experiments and therefore trying something else, we sort of shortchange that because you set OKRs and then, you might be trying to hit those outdated OKRs, even though, you've learned something along the way. And to this, by the way, a lot of OKR experts will say, well, that's an easy solution. You just need to set OKRs more often, set it every quarter instead of every year. And to which, I've heard this said to an executive at a large organization, and they just scoffed and they said, we'd just die if we had to do this multiple times a year. It's hard enough to do it once a year, right?
mhm,
And so uh, to go back to this question of what do you do as a leader, um, you know, one thing that I really empathize with is you've been so used to setting OKRs. That's your approach to having control. So I'm not going to tell you, just from one day to the next, drop OKRs. Now you
mhm,
start using OHLs. Let's do experimentation. I know that sounds downright scary because it's
mhm,
the devil you know. So one thing you can do is, even when you have OKRs, allow for this experimentation, learning, and adaptation, and give your team the scaffolding for experimentation, learning, and adaptation. Even if you have OKRs, fine, great. Define the puzzle for the team, just like I was talking about in sales. Whatever that puzzle was, define what you might have whatever number for sales, but define what is the puzzle you think as a leader
mhm,
you're not 100% sure of, and invite your team so that you have information from the trenches in terms of what is the real problem, what are they seeing, right? And you define the puzzle together and then invite them to give you information on how they're solving this puzzle in terms of how well is it working, what have you learned, what will you try next? And
mhm,
that's how you can move forward together. So now to go back to your question about vanity metrics, right? OKRs often focus on those vanity metrics. It's about customer satisfaction, NPS scores, it's revenues, and when I say vanity, I'm not saying it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, but I
right,
often find that vanity metrics is the sort of stuff that everyone else tracks too. And it becomes the easy benchmark to say, are things working? The CEO, the US CEO of Walmart in the past, he now is in New Zealand, but Greg Foran, he talked about Walmart and he said, Walmart was profitable, but profitability often hides a lot of sins. He was
mm,
saying that, although we were profitable, there were a ton of numbers underneath that weren't looking good in terms of, the engagement from store employees, the number of shelves that were empty, items that were not restocked, etc. Right? Even the quality of the bathrooms. And so you look at such numbers that aren't the vanity metrics necessarily. They're not just the numbers. And that's where you get the real information. Those are so instead of vanity metrics, what I recommend is thinking about leading indicators because vanity metrics are often the lagging indicators. They tell you after the fact whether something went well or not. Leading indicators are the ones that give you the ears on the ground. They are, they might be, what are customers saying? It might be something qualitative. It
mhm,
might be something like, a key feature even in user testing or discussions, etc., did people
mhm,
know how to use it? The next level of leading indicator might be you've tried out a prototype And,
Mhm.
how did people engage with it? The next level beyond that is you launched it, and are people using it? Not just at the beginning, over the next few weeks, are people using it? And how are they using it? Is it because they just landed on it, or they're actually uh, using it because they wanted to, right? Like, dig deeper. You know, it's the non-vanity metrics are all the are all the metrics that actually tell you what's actually happening so that you
Mhm.
can build a story and talk the narrative.
Mhm. Mhm.
I love where you were going before, because you were talking about large organizations and sort of playing devil's advocate.
Mhm.
But, more than devil's advocate, I think these are like real questions that people would
Yeah.
have in terms of, how can I apply this?
Public companies, and I think I'd like to talk about some of the causation of why we still hold on to some of these metrics, particularly the vanity metrics, and then maybe we can talk about, and now with AI, what do we do, and kind of, I think that how are we measuring AI? And we are now in a new wave, and so is this an opportunity to kind of reset some of our habits and ways of being? What do you think about
Mm,
going there?
love it.
Okay. So when we talk about vanity metrics, and you point out vanity doesn't mean that they're not valid. It just means they are not the only metric, and they are probably that lagging indicator instead of a leading indicator, and that they shouldn't just be this rarefied set of metrics as well. I'd love your perspective from what you've seen with the number of organizations in your research. Do you find that there is more rigidity to targets and metrics and maybe the OKR approach with public companies, particularly US companies? So we could say if there's a difference between US, because US companies, right, have to report quarterly to Wall Street versus, right, in Europe or other places where it's every 6 months reporting. But do you feel like publicly traded companies have more attachment to those vanity metrics because of reporting to the street, or not? You're seeing the same thing with private companies because they feel like they need to model what the public companies do. Or maybe there's no correlation at all. I'm just curious.
Oh, this is such a fascinating conversation. There's a global element to this, and also public and private company
Yeah.
element to this. So let's talk about the public versus private. I think in terms of the answer to that, I do think public companies are a lot more short-term driven. And in fact, research shows that since deregulation and since the Reagan era, basically, the stock market has been a lot more short-term driven. And it wasn't until the 1970s, actually, since Milton Friedman's essay that said that a company's goal is to maximize shareholder returns. It wasn't until that point in the 1970s that it really shifted this mentality towards, oh, all we are trying to drive towards is quarter after quarter and, end of year to end of year, like showing results, right? Before that, we were thinking a lot more long term. But on top of that, the what happens is there's definitely this absorption of these are best practices
Mhm.
from public companies, because the view in private companies is, well, these are the companies that made it big. And if they're saying that this is what worked, Google, for example, says OKRs were our secret to success, then of course private companies say, oh, we need to do this too.
Mhm.
Um, by the way, when you talk to anonymous Googlers, some of them joke that actually, OKRs were Google's secret to actually making our competitors fail. So,
Oh, that's funny.
uh, so,
I'm sure I'll get comments from people at Google. Mhm.
so it's not necessarily it's not necessarily a role model for for private companies to follow.
Mhm.
Um, and I do want to talk about the global element of this. I was having a fascinating conversation with someone living in Singapore. His name is Vasu Kolla. And it was I was telling him about, this problem I see with OKRs in the
Mhm,
US and how short term driven we are, this constant drive quarter after quarter, year after year. And he was saying, we don't face the same sort of pressure in a lot of the both private companies that they work with, but even public. There's more of a sense of responsibility for the people that we employ. And if you just take this truly short-term approach,
mhm,
there'll be a lot of people who revolt and say this is not okay for you to do. It
mhm,
might be uh, it, if the government takes such a short-term approach as our government is honestly at the moment, right? Or if it's the opposite, where a company is taking such a short-term approach, whoever it is who is being that short-term driven, the counterparty will revolt against that. Whereas
mhm,
you don't see that sort of checks and balances here in the US at the moment.
mhm,
And so one of the things that I do worry about longer term is where this is going, without those sort of checks and balances. That the US right now is the model that the rest of the world follows. When we say OKRs are the way to do it, organizations in Europe and Asia start to adopt it. OKRs
mhm,
are so popular in Europe now, less so in Asia, but getting there too, right?
mhm,
Um, but as things develop in the US, I think over time it'll be perceived differently. That we are seen as being so short-term driven, something to
mhm,
be wary of.
mhm. Yeah, it'll be interesting and, we don't delve, too much into politics, in this show, but it'll be interesting to watch over the next year, well, next 3-year period of time, because I know it's been floated of do we potentially not have US companies having to report every quarterly, and that's been kind of floated, do you move to every 6 months? And so it'll be interesting the conversations that happen around that. Was that just something thrown out there to see if it sticks against the wall, or what kind of conversations happen and kind of the reckoning and the ripple effects from that, if anything does come, or just even the conversation. So that's just one I'm personally watching, and I'm curious.
But it's
Um,
not just the reporting, right? Because even if you report every 6 months, if you are just trying to optimize for shareholder returns versus,
yes.
some of the other things that actually drive you forward as a business. And I don't just mean in terms of being extractive, right? So, for example, you could be extractive and extract every single dollar possible from your customers,
Mhm,
really screw them over, and if you're a monopoly, they have no choice anyway to do anything, and we deregulate, etc. So we could do whatever we want in terms of reporting. You don't have to report. But if we
mhm,
deregulate and have this approach, this extractive approach,
mhm,
it doesn't necessarily mean that we would do anything differently in terms of philosophy of management, right? Like we
yeah,
can still use OKRs and just be super extractive about it,
mhm.
not reflect on what is it doing and how is it affecting us long term. It's still short term thinking.
What you were just saying there, do you feel like there's an underlying principle or value about business that kinda comes forth? So the topic of being extractive, right? Being so laser focused of how do we get every dollar. For you, is there a principle or a value behind why that might not be the best approach? Being
Yeah.
like, I've heard some people say, a friend that I was just talking to, I will give this to her. She'll probably write a book on it someday, but business is human. Like we get to define how business should operate. Or, for companies that are B Corps, there's a different underlying ethos of, yes, it is the shareholder, but it is also the community and the environment and employees. And so I'm just kind of curious for you, like personally, is there some first principles or values about business and business operating in the world that have formed based on your really diverse experience?
um,
Big question.
so many angles that I want to take this from. Um, when you say B Corp and ethos, people instantly might listen to that and think, well, are you advocating for altruism and saying that profits aren't important? And, I don't say that at all. I'm not advocating for altruism. I do think, as a business, you want to be profitable, etc. But I think it's a question of long term versus short term,
Okay.
right? So let's look at the average tenure of a tech worker in the tech industry. It's reduced to like 1 to 2 years at the moment. So people work in a company for 1 to 2 years and then they move on to the next company. So they often look at their role as just a springboard to the next thing that they want to work on, right? So
Mhm.
what happens when you have this mindset?
Mhm.
And this is very true for executives too. So when you take this mindset, then your own behavior becomes short term too. It's not just that
Mhm.
OKRs are set for a short term
Mhm.
angle, it's also that your own behavior is, well, I just need to show good results for the next year or two, and then I'm moving on anyway, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so what I call this is sort of the seagull approach, where you swoop, poop, and leave. Um, and the big question is, what is the legacy that you want to leave behind, right? Because
Mhm.
seagulls too leave a legacy. It's just not a good one.
Mhm.
um, and so if I look at the example of Intel, when we think about Andy Grove and what made him so successful at Intel in the 80s and 90s, it was that he was taking a long term approach to the business, right? Intel at the time, their memory business was starting to decline. And Andy Grove and the whole team, they had seen that there was an opportunity in microprocessors. In fact, it was actually someone from the trenches who was working on microprocessors. He saw the opportunity, got Intel to buy back the rights for microprocessors, having developed it as a custom project. And then Intel invested a decade of R&D into microprocessors. And at some point, when their memory business was declining, Andy Grove had the intuition to be able to take this puzzle setting and puzzle solving approach. And the puzzle was, what do we do as a business when our
Mhm.
entire business is a memory business? How do we evolve as a company? Right? And what do we do next? And the puzzle that they figured out was that microprocessors was the answer. They experimented, learned, adapted, and they shifted the entire business to microprocessors. And he talks about how that was a difficult transition.
Mhm.
Let's talk about the seagulls who came after Andy Grove, right?
Mhm.
They didn't have this experimentation, learning, adaptation, this puzzle
Mhm.
setting, puzzle solving approach. Their approach was, I'm driving towards business results. They were short term driven. So if you look at the business results under those people, so from 2005 to 2021, it was people like Paul Ottolini, Bob Swan, others, right? So under them, Intel's revenues looked fantastic, but they missed out all the things that mattered. So vanity metrics were great, but in terms of what they actually did, they missed out um, investing in OpenAI. They missed out when Apple asked them to be the chips supplier for
Mhm.
iPhones. They said, nah, no, thank you.
Mhm.
When they could have developed a standalone GPU to compete with NVIDIA, they
Mhm.
decided not to, right?
Mhm.
These were huge misses on their part. So that's
Mhm.
what I mean by this big difference. I'm not advocating for altruism necessarily or being a B Corp, but it's really thinking long term and being able to invest in experimentation, learning, adaptation. Because one thing Andy Grove says is, you can't just learn to experiment, learn, and adapt when your company's in trouble. If you haven't built this muscle all along, you
Mhm.
are going to fail. And this is what you need to do as a leader. Build this muscle so that, when it's a rainy day, you've built that muscle so the team is going to adapt.
So juicy. I love this. Okay. So if I'm a leader, so the context, right? And it's not just in tech, it is every industry that tech touches. Almost every leader is now faced with this question of, do I have an existential threat to my business, or my growth has changed, or we are pivoting from what we once were to another company? How does AI fit into what we're doing? And so everybody's in this profound moment of change, which could be a moment for reflection. So I'm going to assume best intention for all of my listeners that people are in a reflective space. What happens if you're a leader and they're like, am I a seagull? Are we about to have that situation? Or like they can see us like, oh, I could totally see us going down that approach. But nobody wants to be the seagull. Like nobody wants to have their name associated with that. So for people that are at that moment of reflection, that they haven't swooped in, done their damage and gone yet, but it's like, I'm being asked to follow that same pattern. Like what, like either additional word of caution or thing to reflect on, because if that's not what you want to be, either what needs to change from a mindset perspective and like what do they do? Like help that leader that's wrestling with, I don't want to be the seagull.
Yeah. And first of all, I don't mean the seagull analogy from a condescending way at all. It comes from a place of empathy because I've been that seagull, right? We
Mm,
are taught to be seagulls because I agree with you. Nobody sets out graduating from college saying, I am going out there to be a seagull to on the world. We don't graduate from college saying that, right? We want to do better. We want to create change in the world. We are idealistic when we start out. So, how do we become the seagull? And this was something, that I had to ask myself because there was a point when I was working on my startup and I was driven by passion. And yet I felt like the kind of things that I was thinking about were increasingly short term because this was what we were taught to do. And so, um, and so reflection is really what makes you better. I think even in parenting, I find myself constantly questioning myself like, am I a good enough parent? And it's
mhm,
really hard, by the way. So if you are a leader who's reflecting, first of all, I'll tell you, you're not a seagull because reflection is the biggest piece of,
mhm,
what makes it really hard for you, like this questioning yourself, because everything that leadership in the US teaches you is as a leader, there's no self doubt, there's no space for self doubt. So if you are reflecting, good for you. You're already different.
mhm,
So thank you for taking that time to reflect. And reflection is what makes you better because that is how we learn from experience through reflection.
mhm,
And so, what can you do? You can look at an initiative that you've taken on and think about the answers to those three questions. How well did it work? What have I learned? What will we try next, right?
mhm,
And even in taking this approach, what you're doing is you're balancing by reflection, you're going to be able to balance better the long term versus the short term.
mhm,
You first of all, by answering the good and the bad and saying, how well did it work? You're going to build empathy for your team. And by presenting such information, the good and the bad to your team, you're creating space for them to be able to give you the real information from the trenches, where
mhm,
they're not just telling you, oh, everything is great, things are green, right? They'll tell you all of what's actually happening. You can share with them your learnings, right? And that creates a space for learning within your team. And then
mhm,
what you will do next, right? So you can try out this exercise and share it with your team.
mhm,
The second thing I'll say is to not be the seagull. The other thing that you can reflect on is, I like to think about this as a two by two, a yin and yang
mhm,
of long term versus short term. Because when you're a leader, what you're constantly doing is you're balancing this intuition you have for long term versus short term. You're figuring out this yin and yang through intuition. And so instead of doing it through intuition, make it explicit for your team so that it's easy to reflect. So
mhm,
draw an X and a Y axis. Well, the Y axis is this good for your long-term vision or not? Right?
mhm,
And when I say vision, we can talk about what is a good vision. We can talk about that in a moment, but that's your y-axis. Is this good for the vision or not? The x-axis is this good for the short term or not? Meaning, is this helping you survive? Right? And so things that are good for the vision and good for survival, well, those are the easy decisions.
mhm,
Now, if you always just focus on easy decisions, you're being myopic, right? Like that can often be seagull territory. So
mhm,
sometimes you want to invest in the vision. That's when it's good for the long term vision, but it's not great for short term survival. So examples of this might be, maybe you're investing in training for your team. Maybe it is where you're investing time for fixing technical debt or focusing on user research, etc. Right? That's investing in the vision.
mhm,
The opposite of that is when we're taking on vision debt, which is great for survival, but it's not good for the long-term vision. So
Mhm.
an example of this might be, you know what, this big customer is going to pay us mega bucks if we just take on this custom feature. And
Mhm.
we want to say yes because we want to win this mega deal, right? Except we know that in terms of the long term, this is really going to derail us.
Mhm.
And so maybe the right answer is yes, you suck it up and you take on this vision debt.
Mhm.
Or you might decide, we really shouldn't because that would be very seagull of us, right? There's no right answer to this. The
Mhm.
reality is it's all based on reflection. And you might decide that vision debt is exactly what we need to do because we have to survive on another day to fight the good fight. So reflect.
Yeah. You talk about vision debt and technical debt, and I think that's a frame, right? Vision debt and technical debt.
Vision debt versus the other quadrant is investing in the vision.
Um,
Technical debt, I think, is a form of vision debt where
okay.
it's
Okay. So
just, yeah,
the
you're
vision
taking a short term approach.
survival matrix. What would you say to leaders right now, right? Going back to the moment in time where there's big transition and people are feeling survival, like there is an existential threat to my business. And I would imagine that people are skewing and looking at the point of the matrix of like, how do we survive? Like, if you are really feeling that tension and it's like, I'm everywhere in this quadrant. I need to do this. I need to do that. It is, I'm not in one, like up and to the right or like one grid, but I need to optimize for survival at the moment. Like, what advice do you have to help people reconcile that? Because what I hear you saying is it's not an either or, it's a both. And sometimes like more than one thing can be true at the same time, and that's okay. And maybe it's okay to be in one place, but just understand what you're doing for the future. If you have leaders that are like, we're in this existential threat in this matrix, and that's my bias of what I need to optimize for. I don't have the luxury of just vision, or I need to like default alive,
Yeah.
right now, funding wise, right? If you're a startup, what advice do you have? Because it's a really complicated answer.
Yeah. Absolutely. It is complicated. And this is why, I come at this with no judgment. The reality is, you might be a startup and you have to survive and you're in survival mode. Vision debt is exactly what you need to do.
Mhm.
So, uh, the right the question to ask is how are you balancing these different quadrants, right? How much
Mhm.
are you doing in easy decisions, in vision debt, in investing in the vision, versus that danger quadrant, which is bad for vision and survival,
Mhm.
right? So those are the four quadrants. How are you balancing activities across those? So one
Mhm.
of the things that, especially in a moment of transition for your whole team, is, as a leader, typically I found myself just doing this based on intuition, telling the team, especially when I'm in a survival mode, I'm just telling the team, this is the right priority for us right now. This is what you need to do. The
Mhm.
moment I started helping them visualize how we're balancing these quadrants and, why we're taking on vision debt, I was helping them make those decisions for themselves. I was starting to scale my thinking, scale my influence so that they can start to think like me, right?
Mhm.
And by starting to recognize something as vision debt and that we are in survival mode, it's actually counterintuitively, it's more motivating for the team because I am acknowledging that we are doing something that is not good for our long term vision.
Mhm.
And yet, here I am asking you that we need to do this. Can you join me on this journey, right?
Mhm.
If you take on vision debt and you tell your team that we must take on this custom feature, but you don't acknowledge that this is vision debt, it is deeply demotivating to people who care about the vision because they'll be like, does that mean you don't care about the vision? So the very fact that you're acknowledging that this is vision debt
Mhm.
puts you on the same side. You're
Yeah.
on the same side, fighting the same fight, and you're
Yeah.
saying, we're in survival mode. Right now, we're doing more stuff in vision debt. And when you can, every time you invest in the vision, acknowledge that too. it is a proof point for your team that we do care about the vision. We are investing in it when we can, right?
Mhm.
And so, there's a team that I've been working with for a while. We've been using this vision versus survival. And I remember when we first started, a lot of our work was in the vision debt quadrant, right?
Mhm.
But slowly over time, I started to see that things were shifting. As the company was in a better place financially and we had a better market standing, we were starting to do more in the easy decisions and investing in the vision. And it felt better, right? But I
Mhm.
could keep people with me on the journey.
Mhm. It sounds like from a value standpoint of communication not just being something we do, but valuing communication because it's bringing people along for the journey and also understanding the strategy or, the Simon Sinek kind of the why, how, what, and making sure that we explain the why, not just what you're supposed to do and how to go do it, but making sure we take the time that people
Exactly.
understand the why.
And it's a way of explaining the why that is very visual and it takes a facilitative approach. So, in fact, you can get your team to engage with you, and
Mhm.
debate these things with you when there is an opportunity for it. So, there might be new initiatives that either you're proposing or your team is proposing to you, and they can take a post it and say, where on these quadrants does this fall? Right. And
Yeah.
you might have a debate like, I think this falls under easy decisions. And they might explain to you, here's why I actually think it's envision debt quadrant. You might agree and say,
Mm.
okay, we take this on. But this is a way of spreading your way of thinking so that, when your team is in a meeting and you can't be there, they're thinking like you. They know what is the right balance of this yin and yang of vision versus survival. And they
Mhm.
can make decisions like you would have if you had been at that meeting.
Mhm. I like the sticky notes, and I'm a tactile person, I'm a visual person, but the act of having a common visual and not just talking at each other and creating a space to have a common understanding. I know, that's in the product space, a best practice. Don't just talk about it, but make sure you're visualizing kind of your opportunities and solutions and putting it out there. Or, just even that's why you need to get stuff in front of customers. Do you have the same understanding and interpretation of the words? Why and why not? And it helps uncover the tension. So I love that, very practical facilitation idea of get your people in a room and you can do that quadrant. I have a product, I think it's a product specific question, but maybe it applies more broadly. I've heard you talk about the Hippo- Hippocratic oath of product, as well as a concept of digital pollution. And I think this gets to, well, it's vision, but it's also the ethical and responsibility piece that we have as well. I would love for you to talk about what those terms mean and how you wrestle with that. And if you're making the analogy of like the product is the doctor and kind of the do no harm and thinking about collateral damage of decisions. Um, I would love for you to speak to that and kind of your take on those two things.
Oh, um, I love this question because it is something that is close to my heart. Um, let's talk about the Hippocratic Oath of Product first, right? Because one thing that I have realized over time is that as a product person, or honestly, even as a business leader, whether or not you're in the product space, but when you're leading a company or you're building a product, your role is very much like one of a doctor because you're building something, and what you're saying to someone is, I see you have a problem, and here's what I'm prescribing for you. And which is exactly what doctors do, right? They look at the patient and say, I see you're sick, you have a problem, here's what I prescribe.
Mhm.
But they don't then say, okay, well, whatever happens to you after you use this drug, good luck and, Godspeed, right? They take responsibility for your well-being. They want to know how are you doing afterwards, right? Like they don't wash their hands off of it. So why do we do that in product? Why do we then build a product and then say, well, how you use it is up to you. If it causes harm, that's just your fault, right?
Mm.
So one thing that we can think about in product is taking the time to reflect, not just the metrics and, how wonderful the metrics are moving up and to the right, but rather, have we created the change that we intended in the first place? And that's the reflection that I rarely see happen in product, right? For example, Sam Altman from OpenAI was recently interviewed by New York Times. And it was, a year after ChatGPT was released. New York Times asked him on a podcast, they said, it's been a year. What are your reflections since ChatGPT was released? And you know what his answer was? He said, well, it's been so busy, I haven't had time to reflect. And you think, oh my God, someone who just released ChatGPT into the world says they haven't had time to reflect on what they have created, right? It is downright scary to me. If we
Mm.
don't reflect on what is the change we're bringing to the world, how can we possibly know how to do better? Right? That is the key to learning to do better. To first of all, think about what is the intent? Like, what
Mhm.
is the change we want to bring about? And then we can think about what do we do better? Which actually brings me to something I mentioned earlier, which is vision, right? Like, when I talked about that y axis of is this a good vision fit or not, I was saying, you have to have a clear vision. And that's part of this Hippocratic oath, too, right? Which is, what is the change that you wanted to bring about? It's not okay to just throw things at the wall and see what sticks in terms of metrics, right? We have to think about, are we creating the change we intended?
Mhm.
And so, in the first book I wrote, Radical Product Thinking, which is behind me, so in that book, I write about a fill in the blanks vision statement so that we can really, instead of falling in love with our words,
Mhm.
we can focus on what is the change that we want to bring about.
Mhm.
Why is that change needed? Because maybe it's not.
Mhm.
And then finally, how you'll bring about that change. So here is an example of a radical vision statement for a startup that I had. Today, when amateur wine drinkers want to learn about wine and find good wines along the way, they have to find attractive looking wine labels or find wines that are on sale. This is unacceptable because it leads to so many disappointments, and it's hard to learn about wine in this way. We envision a world where finding wines you like is as easy as finding movies you like on Netflix.
Mhm.
We are bringing about this world through a recommendations algorithm that matches wines to your taste and an operational setup that delivers these wines to your door. And this is the kind of vision that you need.
Mhm.
One that describes exactly what problem you're setting out to solve and that explains why you're doing it, right? So I had said nothing about my startup, but hopefully you knew exactly what we were doing and why we were doing it. And that's the kind of vision that you want, not the Facebook kind of, we want to create a world that's open and connected. Well, what does that mean? And
That looks
why do
like.
you need a world like that?
Mhm. W- What do you say for people that are working in platform companies that are maybe not building the applications themselves, but are building the tools and the platforms and wrestling with this Hippocratic oath? Because there's a level of no matter what you do, even if it's an application, customers will use stuff in ways that you never intended. Like, I think that's the thing that every product person learns of, like, oh, that was a really creative use of something that I thought was really narrow and specific, and they do something totally different with it, or how they use fields or how they update workflows even on the app side. But for, those people that are listening, that are creating tools and platforms specifically, and they're individual contributors, they are not the people setting the vision. How would you help them think about like their personal responsibility and kind of that Hippocratic oath of product?
I love this question because when you say, what would you say to people working on a platform? We often use the word platform as a cop out for responsibility.
Mhm.
That we say, because this is a platform, people can use it in different ways, whether it is um, CRISPR or Facebook, or something like Palantir, or face recognition that's used by ICE um, or by the police force, etc. Like, we can say very easily that I've built a product and technology, but you can do whatever you want with it. Oppenheimer said that about the atom bomb, right? Like we built it and we will build, whatever technology allows you to do, but it's people's responsibility and government's responsibility to use it carefully, right? He did regret that, but it was when it was too late. The people who built the like button on Facebook later said that they regretted it, but then it was too late. And then there's the example of Jeffrey Hinton, who's named, the father of neural networks. He, for instance, came up with neural networks, created all of Google's AI products, and then he conveniently said, "Oh, now I'm quitting Google so that I can finally criticize the company and talk about the dangers of AI." We always say afterwards, "Oh, it's too late." He built all of this at Google.
Mhm.
And then he says, "Oh, now I'm quitting Google to finally criticize the company about,
Mm.
uh, just all the dangers of AI." Like,
Uh-huh.
come on. Like, all of this is a cop out in terms of taking personal responsibility. So, if we're talking to our listeners, if you're reflecting, I
Mhm.
think the big question is, what is the world that you want to create with your labor? Because the reality is, you are voting for the world that you want to create
Mhm.
with your labor. You vote for the world you want to create with your labor. It is no longer true that we vote with our dollars, because the more you have monopolies, the less regulation you have,
Mhm.
it is much harder to vote with our dollar.
Mhm.
So, as an employee, you hold power
Mhm.
with your labor. So,
Mhm.
what do you choose to do is the big question.
Mhm.
And so, based on that, if you then reflect in terms of your personal vision, your vision versus survival, because you got to pay the bills too.
Mhm.
How much vision debt are you taking on? How much are you investing in the vision versus easy decisions, etc. Right? Um, these are questions for you to answer for yourself.
Mhm.
The one thing I'll say is, there are a lot of people who are in um, university who say, "You know what, I'll just work for hedge funds for 5 years. And then when I make enough money, then I'm going to go do good things." But just know that it changes you so profoundly. Like, people I know from college who used to be friends, right? They moved into the finance industry and they're no longer the same people.
Mhm.
When you take on so much debt, so much vision debt, sorry, it changes who you are as a person.
Mhm.
And so this cop out of, I'll just take on lots of vision debt initially, but eventually I'll pay it back and invest in the vision. That is a really tough sell. This is the philosophy of this approach of effective altruism. Um, it really does not work. That's the reality.
I love the example that you just gave around, your friends that go into finance or hedge fund, and no criticism, right? You're making an observation of, they thought that they were going to do vision and then they went, for money. And I think what I like personally related in that story, right? My background, I started out right with international human rights work and peace and justice and loving supportive family, but I needed to take out student loan debt,
Mhm,
right? And I had $100,000 of student loan debt. I'm working in philanthropy. I'm doing good in the world. I'm feeling impact, but I have a really high interest rate on $100,000 and I'm
mhm,
20 something. No assets to really pay that off on a $30,000 a year salary. And I made the pivot when I was approached to go into consulting to take that to take that leap because mama needed was in survival mode as well. I felt like for myself how I rationalized it and threaded the needle was I was working on products that I thought would make organizations be better at managing their money and that meant there was more money for universities and governments and nonprofits to do good in the world. That was
mhm,
how I rationalized it for myself. So, but I do relate with that tension of, okay, but that is not all of me. Like I rationalized it. And yes, that is true, but there's other vision and impact I want to create in the world, hence having the podcast. Um, for people listening that are wrestling on a personal level of vision versus survival. I'd like your thoughts on what happens if you realize that you want your matrix to look a little different than maybe what it does right now. And not from a place of judgment, but just if you want your matrix to look different.
Yeah, exactly. And again, this point that it is not from a place of judgment is super important. I think in the US, the cost of universities, etc., continues to rise exponentially, right? The kind of student debt people are forced to take on, it is crazy. And so this is not from a place of judgment at all. In the US, there are just the social security network that we have to catch you when you're in trouble. It's really sort of disintegrating very quickly before our eyes, right? And so thinking about how do I survive is so important. What you said resonates a lot for me because, I too was feeling this pain of being in the corporate world in roles where it wasn't soul filling for me, right? Because I set out from school wanting to do other things. But here's the first thing, just by having this vision versus survival, recognizing that you might be taking on vision debt. And in this case, it feels more like soul debt, right?
Yeah.
It feels like soul debt because you kind of have to survive and pay the bills. And so just recognizing that you're taking on this soul debt and that it's not satisfying helps. One, in terms of feeling like you're preserving your vision, uh, and you're recognizing this as soul debt. Two, the fact is you can't really change your circumstances unless you win the lottery right now. So you're kind of needing to survive and continue this job, which maybe isn't the most soul filling for you, right? And so if you're taking on that vision debt, recognizing it as such gives you back the sense of control. Um, and that in itself is helpful. Just recognition is helpful. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is if you say that, I now finally have the means to be able to change it, that I can do something else. This is where I would say there's a friend of mine who was working at Google for a really long time. And, he kept saying, well, what I really like about Google is the paycheck. And I really don't like what they do. And I was saying, well, in that case, just you could interview around. You don't know what else is out there and what they're willing to pay. So just take the time to sort of interview and see what's out there to network, right? And so um, this is the part that I want to perhaps come back to. In terms of figuring out what is soul filling for you, it's not always obvious in terms of, well, what do I try next? And this is where, this approach of thinking about, first of all, what is your vision for yourself? What is it that you want to do? That's a very, very hard question. But even if you look at that fill in the blank statement that I talked about from Radical Vision Statement, I once wrote such a vision statement for myself. What do I want in terms of my career? Um, and I'm happy to share that vision, by the way, if you want. I'll tell you what I wrote in that vision. Um, but first of all, you can write such a vision statement for yourself to really think about what is it that I want and treat that as a hypothesis. And you can use this experimentation, learning, adaptation approach so that you can experiment with things, try, learn from it, and then figure out what would you try next, right? And you constantly balance all of this using the yin and yang of vision versus survival to know how to balance this long term versus short term. How big a risk can you take? Maybe you don't have kids right now and you have enough in the bank so that you could take a sabbatical for a year and say, you know what, I can afford the time to be able to really figure out what I want to do. Or maybe you cannot afford to do that. So think about what is the level of risk, etc., that you can take. Think
Mhm.
about, how well did it work? What have I learned? What will I try next?
I love that. And we have very different backgrounds, perspectives, and yet I love kind of coming together around this idea of experimentation, right? Having this called the Great Life Experiment. And I even say that I think the most important venture you ever build is your life. And that is the personal and the professional and the business. And um, episode 32, for those people listening, there I actually put out career roadmap framework very similarly of like, where are we starting from, right? Using product, thinking of what's the problem, what's the vision, where do we want to go? What do you need to get there? And then what are your experiments? So for those people listening, whether it's the matrix column, if it's just jotting down, if you need spreadsheets, right? Take what works for you, leave the rest, but it's kind of getting back to the concept and the spirit of experimentation and getting back to what is the greater vision, like what are you ultimately solving for as well. Do you have any final thoughts, takeaways for people that have, spent their time with us today that you want to make sure they leave with?
Do you want to hear the personal vision?
I do. Yes. So I love
Okay, let's
personal
go for
vision.
it. Um, so the personal vision that I landed on, and by the way, this took a long time and wasn't obvious to me at the beginning. So please don't feel like just because it sounds easy that, you should be able to write one like this. Today, when my family, so meaning my husband and my two kids, want to talk about their emotions and have emotional support, um, and feel supported and that they have a partner in life, they have to turn to me, or be completely self reliant.
Mhm.
This is unacceptable because without that support and that sort of partnership, they're all going to need, years of therapy to be secure, happy adults.
Love it.
This is um, the world I envision is one where I have a family that is happy, and that brings me joy. And also, I'm creating a people who are going to be happy, secure, and able to spread joy. I'm bringing about this through um, taking on a professional life that gives me emotional bandwidth for my personal life so that I can have Gandhi like patience.
Mm,
So, this is the vision that I landed on at the end.
mhm.
It took me a while. For this, I had to experiment, learn, and adapt. I had to try, taking on different full time roles, taking on roles in different sorts of companies. And then I ended up writing a book to doing consulting, etc. And this is where I landed as a vision over time, learning really what works for me. So treat your vision as a hypothesis, a stake in the ground, and you can really craft your life through sort of this experimentation, learning, and adaptation, and by reflection. And so, finally, maybe one thing I would say is aside from this vision that you can download, or you can read about in the Radical Product Thinking book, you can also get the OHL's toolkit. Where I talk about puzzle setting, puzzle solving, to build this experimentation, learning, adaptation mindset, and we can add that in the show notes in terms of where you can get this. And if you like, you can share with me your story as you use OHLs in this approach. I would love to hear from you. And just in case you share your story with me about OHLs, it might just make it into the next book that I'm working on.
Oh, Radhika, thank you so much for all of your wisdom, the perspective that you had, and the frameworks that you gave people. And we will make sure that we have everything linked in the show notes. And I'm sure we will have more conversations to come and definitely come back when the book is out as well.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for
Thank
having me.
you.
I've so enjoyed our conversation.
Me too.